Alright, welcome to the next video of Flight Sim School. So today we're going to look at the last bit with regards to the wind discussion we've had in the last few videos, and we're going to look specifically at how to calculate how much crosswind is too much crosswind to take off in the plane that you're flying. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to jump straight into the game. We'll quickly look at how to do the calculation and then just do a few takeoffs and see what it looks like in the game. Alright, so let's jump straight into the cockpit. Alright, here we are back in the Cub, and we've got our weather up, and as we can see, the wind's blowing from the northwest towards the southeast. Our runway is runway 32, so we're not exactly facing into the wind, but it's not exactly a crosswind either. So in these types of scenarios, we still need to calculate how much wind is actually going across the airplane, because regardless of whether it's a full crosswind or a slight crosswind, as the case is now, we still need to know how much of that crosswind component we need to take into account to decide if we can safely take off or not. So in the Cub, the maximum speed at which you can take off in a crosswind is 15 knots. But what happens when the wind's blowing from a slightly different direction, as it is right now? To do that, basically you can do a very quick calculation, at least for the game. Probably in real life you'd want to do something a little more extensive and a little more detailed to make sure. But for the plane, there's a very simple method you can do, and that's what we're going to look at now. The reason it's still important, even though this is just a game, is that if the winds are too strong and they're coming across the plane too strongly, you aren't going to be able to apply enough rudder to keep the plane flying straight down the runway. What you'll end up happening is if the wind is just too strong, you'll apply maximum rudder. The wind's going to keep pushing your plane sideways, and you're going to end up off the runway before you can take off. Alright, so let's look at how to actually calculate that crosswind component. So the easiest way to do it is to basically calculate the difference between your runway's heading and the direction the wind is coming. In our case, that'll be about 15 degrees. So our runway is on heading 320 and the wind's coming from around 305. That gives us a difference of 15 degrees. Now, with that number, what you can do is imagine you're looking at an analog clock. Pretend those degrees are minutes instead. That would mean that you are about a quarter past the hour, so you're a quarter of the way around the clock, which means that the crosswind component for your flight will be 1/4 of the actual wind that's blowing at that time. So what that means is that the wind could actually be much stronger than 15 knots, and you could still very safely take off. You just have to make sure that the angle at which the wind is blowing will allow you to do so. Of course, for high winds, the danger is that you could potentially take off with a fairly high wind value. The winds could shift, and at that point, you would be in a bit of trouble because you wouldn't be able to land on the runway that you initially took off from. At that point, you'd have to find an alternate runway that's facing a little bit more into the wind so that you could safely land, depending on how strong the wind is blowing. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to actually go through and we're going to do a few takeoffs with a few different wind speeds and wind directions and basically see how they go with our max crosswind, which I'll remind you in the Cub is 15 knots. And right now we've got wind blowing from 305 degrees, and I am just going to set the wind to be, we'll say, 30 knots instead. And I will set the gust to match, and it's already like that. Perfect. So right now we've got a wind blowing of 30 knots, and our runway is on a heading 320, and the wind is blowing from 305, we'll say. So what we have is a 15-degree difference between our runway and our wind angle. So 15 minutes is a quarter past the hour on the analog clock. So basically, if we multiply 30, which is the current speed of the wind, by 1/4, you end up with 7.5 knots, which is the actual crosswind component for that takeoff. So in theory, even with the winds at 30 knots here, I should be able to take off with very little trouble. So let's try that. Alright, everything's set. I'll just apply full power. And here we go. So I'm applying a little bit of rudder and a little bit of left aileron to compensate for the wind there. But as we saw, we took off pretty much with very little difficulty. Probably if I had been a little smoother on the rudder, you would have stayed a little straighter down the center line. And if I had been a little better on the aileron, probably the wings wouldn't have banked as much to the right. We'll try and correct that for our next takeoff. So that went fairly well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually just going to reset the flight. That's one of the beauties of the simulators. You can just try these things over and over again until you get them right. So I'm just going to reset the flight now, and I'll meet you back on the runway to try a different calculation and different wind speed. Alrighty, here we are back on the runway, and we're going to make our second attempt now. So I am going to set the wind to be blowing from 290, and I will set the gust to match, and the speed we're going to be looking for this time is 25 knots. So let's do that calculation again, just to make it a little bit clearer. So basically 25 knots, wind blowing at 290. The difference between the runway angle and the wind is 30 degrees, so that's 320 minus 290. And 30 degrees, if you think about your analog clock, is half past the hour. And half past the hour means that we would multiply our wind speed, which is 25 knots, by 0.5, which would give us a crosswind component of 12.5 knots. Which means we're just under our maximum crosswind level, even with the winds blowing at 25 knots from this angle. So we're okay to try another takeoff attempt. So I will just close that off, and let's do it again. So we're on the runway. Now last time, as you saw, we moved a little bit off to the left as the wind was blowing across the plane. That will happen again, obviously, because the wind is still blowing from left to right. And also the wind sort of banked the wings to the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to apply a little bit of aileron as well to keep the wings level as we're doing our takeoff roll. So I've got the wings slightly banked, and once we start accelerating, I'll also use the rudder to keep us flying straight down the runway. So let's give that a go. Alrighty. There we go. So that was a little bit better. I didn't quite apply enough rudder at the start again. Maybe a little bit too much aileron. But we did get safely into the air in this 25 knot semi-crosswind. And if we wanted to, we could just go around and land, but just like we did last time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset the flight here, and we'll try again with some slightly different settings this time. Alright, so we are back on the runway, and this time the wind is blowing from 240 at 15 knots. And we'll see why I selected 15 knots in a second. Just like last time, we'll do our back of the napkin calculation. So our runway is on a heading 320, and the wind is blowing from 240, which gives us 80 degrees difference between the runway and the wind. Now, 80 degrees is past a full hour on the analog clock, if you pretend that your degrees are minutes, which means that basically we have to assume that it's a full crosswind in this case. Which means our max crosswind speed in this plane is 15 knots, which means that's basically the limit. So this should be alright for takeoff, and we're gonna try that takeoff right now. So again, I will slowly add the power so that basically I get a feel for how much rudder I'm gonna need to keep the plane flying straight, or as straight as possible anyways. That seems about right. And now I'll just apply full power. The tail will come up quickly. I apply a little bit of left aileron to keep the wings level. And there we go. We're in the air. I can let go of the rudder and just crab into the wind so that we hold our heading. Alright, so we are going to go back to the runway one last time to push the limits of this plane and see how the flight model holds up when you go beyond the maximum limit of the plane. So I'll see you back on the runway in a few seconds once again. Alright, so we are back on the runway, and what we're going to do is we're going to do one last test that's going to push the plane beyond its max crosswind limit. So I've set the wind to be blowing from 240, and I've set it to 30 knots, which is basically double what the recommended max crosswind speed is for the Cub. So we're going to give this a go and see what happens. Probably we'll still be able to do it, but it might not be pretty. So let's see. Just gonna once again just apply power slowly so we get moving and get a feel for how much rudder I'm gonna need to keep the plane straight, which is gonna be a fair bit. And now I'll just apply full power. Oh boy. And you can see the wings wanted to tip there. I hadn't applied enough aileron, and this wind is really ridiculous. But we did manage to take off. I wouldn't attempt a landing in this, to be honest. But we did manage to take off successfully. I'm not sure you would want to do that in an actual plane, but in the game, why not? That's why we're here, to have a little fun. So that's all I wanted to show you today. I hope you learned a little bit about the crosswind calculation and how to go about doing that. The one thing to keep in mind, even though the numbers I used basically were always rounded to fit either a quarter of an hour, half an hour, or 3/4 of an hour, or more than an hour, what you can do is just round to the closest 15-minute interval when you're doing your calculation. That's pretty much sufficient for in-game. Probably not in real life, but for our purposes, for just knowing if you're going to be able to take off in the plane or not, it'll pretty much do the trick. So again, I hope you learned something useful in this video, and if you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you again next time.